Okay, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to have Laurie Williams here with us from North Carolina State. Laurie is the interim department head and a professor at North Carolina State. She's co-director of the Science of Security Lablet that's sponsored by the NSA. And I guess you recently became a IEEE fellow, so congratulations on that. Her research interests are in the area of software security and agile system development, among other areas. And she's going to talk to us today about, she's going to motivate us, I think.
Trying to.
If not us, then who? So I look forward to it. Thanks, Laurie.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction. And the motivation on this slide is the Olympics. So you may have heard the Olympics last week at the opening ceremony. Attackers got in and disrupted the opening ceremony. There were people who bought tickets to the opening ceremony who couldn't print their tickets. The website was down. So the message really there is that if an attacker wants to target something, so far, pretty much they can get it, including the Olympics. And so us, the computer scientists, the attackers, they are computer scientist types. We're the computer scientist types. We're the ones who can stop them. So, we need to get on board with that, or more on board with that. So Trent mentioned that I am the co-director of the Science of Security Lablet, which is an NSA center. Just to tell you a little bit more about that before I get started. So for the last 6 years, we've been what's called Science of Security Lablet. Carnegie Mellon and Illinois have been, since the beginning, with us as well as lablets. Really what I want to talk about is this meaning of science of security. So what NSA thought back in 2011 when this started was that the attackers were really winning and that they would often do something and then we would come behind and fix it. They would do something else, we'd come behind and fix it. And what they really wanted was for us to get underneath the basic behaviors and the principles of what attackers do so that we can get ahead of them. And so that's why they created the Science of Security program. When they did that, they charged the 3 schools with coming up with a smaller set of hard problems to attack because we couldn't solve all of security. And so the 5 hard problems are up on this screen, just a brief overview. One is scalability and composability, and that's to say that all systems these days are made up of other systems. Even a car is made up of 700 systems. And so it's hard enough to know that a system is secure, but when you put it together with other systems, is the big system secure? That's the basic question there. Resilience is another hard problem, and that is to say, within a system, if a certain component of that system is under attack, can the system stay up and recover and potentially collect some information about the attacker? The one in the middle is metrics. So metrics, security metrics to say, is this system secure enough to release? And along the way, what are the indicators to say, what practice should we be using in order to develop a secure system? Up at the top is policy-based secure collaboration, and that's a hard problem about different players within one system could have different policies, different preferences. And within one system, can the system abide by the differing policies? And then the final one are the humans. The humans are the ones that create all of the instability in a system. We tell computers what to do, but the humans do whatever they want to do. And we really look at 3 different types of humans in that hard problem. One, of course, is the attacker. What we have here, the attacker does whatever they want. Another type of human that we look at are software developers. And that's something that we'll be talking about today is, in today's environment, due to lack of education and other factors, more and more insecure code is being pumped out every day. And so that's a type of human that we consider is how do we get it so that developers can develop secure code more often. And then finally, another type of user that we talk about are the human users of a system. Your mother, executives of companies, people who don't necessarily know how to act securely. That's another type of user. So that's just an overview of the Science of Security program. And now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the topic. If not us, then who? First of all, by showing a little video.
The air conditioning is blasting, the music is blasting, and I can't see anything because of the windshield wiper fluid.
Okay, do it. Do it. Kill the engine.
So we're killing the engine right now.
It says park sense actually can't accelerate.
All right, so what happened there? This was back in 2015. You may have heard about it. There were some researchers that took over a Chrysler Jeep. And you could see it was making the windshield wipers go, was making the radio loud, and ultimately stopped the car. So they were actually able to do that. So that's a concern, of course, that attackers could do that to our cars. But another thing that we need to consider is how do we get fixes out to users? And so what happened back in 2015 was Chrysler, the only way that they could fix this security problem, which was identified, was to send USB sticks out to all the car owners. What do you think about that? How effective do you think that was? Not so effective. What would you do if you got a USB stick in the mail? Who thinks that they would do? What was it?
Plug it into all my computers.
Plug it into all your computers? So, do you think you would actually plug it in and fix your car? Not likely, and we're computer scientists. So that's to say that not only did Chrysler have a vulnerability, but they didn't have a mechanism to get a fix out. Conversely,
我们可以通，还有这一辆。
So those were some Chinese researchers that were able to do all those things to a Tesla. Yes, bad that they could do all those things, absolutely. They actually, back in 2015, they had the similar type of demo to the last one, but they were able to do even more, and they did all of those demos just a couple months ago. So again, Tesla needs to beef up their security, but at least Tesla, let's see where the, Tesla is able to fix their vulnerabilities over the air. So from an end-to-end standpoint, what both of those show is that we need to care about security, preventing vulnerabilities, detecting them when they're there, and also being able to respond effectively. And this is a case where Chrysler didn't have an effective mechanism, but Tesla had a better mechanism. All right, so one thing that we know is that attackers are they're unceasing. They're gonna keep going. I had a conversation today about, what's happening. Are we not getting any better as a field because attackers just keep, going on and attacking more and more? We hear about it every day. But I believe that the attackers, we are caring more about security, but they are continuing on. And so really, security is all of our business. Everyone in this room, whether you be in networking or operating systems or user interface, all of us need to get on the board for getting cybersecurity. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. So the situation today is that the supply of cybersecurity professionals is low. At this point, there's 1.8 million jobs unfilled that need cybersecurity expertise, growing to 3.5 million in the next few years. So we need to make sure everyone is educated in cybersecurity. The bottom chart shows that the vulnerabilities and attacks are on the rise as well. So it's kind of a bad situation where not enough people that are trained, and also vulnerabilities and attacks are going up. So this is really a call to action, this presentation. And there's 3 different types of audiences. This clicker, you have to, oops, I've hit it a few times. So first of all, one of the audiences for this are professors. So professors need to teach security. And as you'll see, what I'm going to be talking about is what industry does. So this type of information about what industry does for cybersecurity is interesting to me as a professor because it informs me to what I should be teaching my students to make sure that they're prepared. And so I hope that others find that information interesting as well. The next are just software developers. Whether you're a student going out to industry, you're already a practitioner, but this information about the types of things industry does related to security will help you know what you should learn to do, what you should use on the job, and the types of skills you should own as you are helping us with cybersecurity. And then finally, researchers. And so the information, again, about what industry does or doesn't do, to me, informs two things. One is, how do I make it easier for developers to develop code securely? And how can I make it harder for attackers to attack? So from a research standpoint, on one hand, making it easier for developers, the other hand, making it harder for attackers. And there's signals within this industry data that I'll be talking about for all of those. So what I'll be talking about are two observational studies. And so what this is here, this is a monkey eating a banana. And just to make an analogy, just say I wanted to study monkeys and what they eat. What I would do is, go into a jungle and say, what are the monkeys eating? Oh, that monkey's eating a banana. And then go to another jungle. Oh, that monkey's eating a banana too. And eventually decide monkeys must eat bananas. So that's an observational study, just looking at what's happening. And that's what the types of studies are that I'll be talking about, just observing what industry is doing. Now, like with the monkeys, it's not monkeys should eat bananas, monkeys should eat 5 bananas. It's not prescriptive advice. At this point, it's really just observing what industry does and being able to reflect on, based upon what they do, what should we do as practitioners, educators, and researchers. The strength is this data is very representative of what's going on. What is a weakness of the data is that there's not a tie to say, and if you do it, you'll have less vulnerabilities, or anything, and if you do it, it'll cost $5 million more, or you'll save 300,000. There's no dependent variable. It's just observing the practices of industry. So a lot of names on here. What this is where I got a lot of the data. Now, a lot of the data was collected by an organization originally called Cigital, now called Synopsys. If you know the name Gary McGraw, he's very well known in the security industry. This is his company, and this is his data, which he shared with me. So what Gary's been doing since 2008 is going out to companies, he and some of his colleagues, going out to companies and looking at what the practices are that the companies have adopted related to cybersecurity. So they came up with, before they started this, they came up with 113 different practices they believed companies should do based upon their extensive experience. And then they go into companies, and the companies pay a good amount of money for them to come in and observe and collect information about those 113 practices and whether they're done or not. So it's not a simple checklist. It's actually time spent with the companies, interviewing and looking at artifacts. Okay, so they've done that for the last 10 years. But what this is BSIM 8 data, the 8th iteration of it. And when they do that, they always drop off the beginning part. They think, so it's 42 months worth of data, and before that, they think it's not relevant anymore. So you can look at these, lots of companies, 95 companies. I was going to mark the big names, but then I thought your big names might be different than my big names. But these are the types of companies that he visited. Another bunch of data is data that I've collected personally. Trent said that one of my research areas was agile software development, which is something that I did back starting in 1998. And agile software development, I would say, like, the next generation of agile software development is continuous deployment, or DevOps. And in this type of a mode, companies are deploying code many times a day. So companies like Netflix and Google and Facebook, they're deploying code like 2,000 times a day. So something that a developer develops this morning might be out to some real customer today. by the afternoon. And so we've had what's called the Continuous Deployment Summit for the last 3 years, and we're doing it again this year. And the first one was at Facebook, second one at Google, third one at Netflix, and now we're going to Microsoft. And we talk about a lot of things in that summit, really mostly related to what is it like to transition your business to developers deploying so rapidly. One of the topics we talk about is security. And so I have some observation about the use of security or the security practices in such a rapid environment. So what I'll talk about, I'm going to divide up the data into 4 different segments. The first thing I'm going to talk about are what the top people do. So the people who do most of the practices that have been at this for quite a long time, what do they do? Then I'm going to divide up the rest of the practices into 3 groups: prevention, detection, and response. That's what we do, related to vulnerabilities. We try to prevent vulnerabilities, we detect them once they're in there, try to detect them once they're in there, and we respond when there's an attack. Okay, so I'm going to start out with what the top people do. And so why do we care about that? And I guess this slide is to say, why do we care about what the top people do? It informs me as a teacher of what I should teach. It should hopefully, and any other teachers, it should hopefully inform students and practitioners about what kind of practices should you adopt in order to emphasize cybersecurity. So this is actually, I know the projector is kind of dark, but these are copycats. Pretty cute picture of a copycat, huh? A cat's on the copy machine. The idea there is if you can see what people who have been dedicated to security for a long time, what they do, that can help you inform what you should do. The way we came up with these groups is we took the 95 firms and the practices of these 113 practices that they do, which ones behave most similarly. So we didn't apply any judgment, we just used statistics to look at the groupings. And it turned out that there were 5 clusters of companies. And the ones that we'll look at are the ones in group 1. And so you can see these group 1 companies, they're much higher. So the y-axis is raw score. The raw score is the number of practices they use out of the 113. So you can see this group 1 is all the way up in the 80s as their average score, much separated from the other groups. Okay, so these are the groups that have the most mature cybersecurity program. Oops. So what kinds of characteristics are of those firms? So there's 4 different charts here. The upper left is the age. So you can see on the upper left that the people in this cluster have been doing a cybersecurity program for an average of 8 years or more. So they're quite mature in their program. On the right is called SSG size. We'll talk about SSG a little bit more, but that's Software Security Group. And so that is to say that these companies have a dedicated security group at the corporate level that would be dedicated towards the success of a security effort. And if you again look at the cluster 1, that's the largest corporate group. On the bottom is Satellite. Satellite group are the security experts that are out in the development organizations doing security in their own teams. And again, you can see that there's more in the Satellite group among these. And then finally, the bottom is development size. So you can see that the average development size of the organization is higher. So these group 1 are higher. Now, one thing I'll say is Gary gave me all of the spreadsheets, all of the data of these interviews, but he did strip out the companies. So I can't tell you, I don't know who, there's 6 companies in that group, I don't know who they are. He's trying to protect the anonymity of the companies. So these 6 companies, they can be in more than one domain, but they are 3 financial companies, 2 independent software vendors, which is something like Microsoft, a company that supplies software products, 2 tech companies, I'm not sure how they differentiate that, and 2 cloud companies. 5 of the 6 companies have had Synopsys go and assess them multiple times. And so of the 5 that have been assessed multiple times, you see their score, which is out of 113, in the chart, and then there's a little spark line that would show you that generally, each time they get assessed, they have adopted more practices. So up at the top is a chart of the practices that all 6 of these companies do. And so when you can look at them and think about, these 8 practices, everyone does. I should consider doing them myself. So in the middle, I don't know if this has but in the chart are the practices. On the right is a comparison to all the 95 companies. So 100% of the cluster 1 companies do these, but you can see up at the top, 88% do the topmost, and at the bottom, only 49% do it. So you can see that this cluster of companies is well ahead of other companies in many respects. What I have in the bottom are some of the major trends among those 8 practices. And on the left is what I'll call DevOps versus DevSecOps. Among those 8 practices, there's a number of practices that would indicate the communication between those that respond to security incidents and the development team is tight. And so they have adopted this tight relationship. Now, DevSecOps is it's a movement within the industry, and I can't say that I have seen companies that really embrace that. Among the Continuous Deployment Summit, not so much either. So I can't say that these, I don't know these 8 companies, but likely they haven't gotten to the point where the security people are tightly aligned with the development organization, but they certainly are tighter than other organizations. So it is important to have the security people have a great relationship, a tight relationship with the development team. The other practice, which is on the right, that is a high use is the use of tools, and that tool there is a static analysis tool. So static analysis tool can look statically at your code and identify bug patterns in it. There's a lot of commercial tools. Fortify, Synopsys has a tool, Coverity. There's a number of commercial tools that you can buy that will specifically find security vulnerabilities within your code. And that's also another high practice that's used by these companies. The last one is use a risk questionnaire to rate the application. And so this is a practice where the software security group would have a survey and would ask questions about an application to assess how risky is this application, how security critical is it. And they would impose a different process on an organization or on a team depending upon the criticality. So does this particular application, does it have social security numbers, credit card numbers, personal identifiable information, or something like baseball scores? Depending upon the criticality, it would give you a different process. So those are the practices the cluster 1 companies do. The next tier, where it's 5 of the 6, here's some of the practices. There's 23 of them, but I grouped them into 6 different bullets. One is to establish a secure development lifecycle. So to have steps within your development lifecycle that institute some of these practices. So establishing one of those. Incorporating compliance. We'll talk more about compliance in a little bit, but companies have a lot of regulations, policies, and whatnot they need to work with in order to be security compliant. And so how do they do that? And we'll talk about that more in a minute. They also establish their own security standards and policies within the company. They have training. They have a software security group, and finally they perform security testing. The ones that are in bold, I just bold because these are the ones that we could be teaching within universities and learning for students within universities. Okay, so as far as people owning, they're on the job and they're owning the fact that they need to develop secure code. There's such a delay on this. It's probably going to jump 5 slides. Okay, so So this is when you are the midnight call. As we move to an environment where software is deployed all the time, so I mentioned earlier, Facebook and whatnot deploying 2,000 times a day. The developer of those systems that are deployed all the time gets the call in the middle of the night to say, you disrupted something. And so just because there's such an immediate feedback mechanism, the developers, I've talked to lots of them and witnessed a lot of conversations. They are much more aware of the impacts of their own quality and security and privacy. And they're much more willing to say, can you review my code and write unit tests and do lots of things to make sure that their code is of high quality. So that's a good thing. Another thing that I observed within the continuous deployment companies is the use of shameless retrospectives. So when you do make a mistake, being willing to say, this is what I did, and please don't ever do this. Sharing the mistakes that you make so that other people don't make the same mistakes, particularly when it comes to a security vulnerability. And the shameless is really the important thing, that being able to admit that you made a mistake. That's something that's was prevalent among the continuous deployment companies. Okay, so that's the end of what the top people do. Now we're going to go into the prevent, detect, and response. The first observation that I made is I went through all of the practices of the 113, and I was looking for, not all of them are the prevent, detect, respond, but 58 of them are. And I looked at the usage, and I'll show you the detail behind this in a minute. And what you can see as far as the usage of the practices of prevent, detect, respond, where the y-axis is percent, the average use of the practices, most often organizations are still responding to attacks. Then after that, they're detecting them, and least likely are they preventing them. So the activities that developers could do to prevent the vulnerabilities in the first place are the least used. And so what we really want to do is shift it to the left so that we're preventing the vulnerabilities in the first place, not responding to them, and also increase usage overall. So the first group that we'll talk about are the prevention ones. And again, I don't expect you to see all the information on this. The next slides will talk about it. But a couple things I want to point out. So up at the top are 2 practices, again, for prevention, for bugs. And then the next are 29 practices that are focused on flaws. So I want to define bugs and flaws. So bugs are small problems in code that are a vulnerability. For example, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, something where a small amount of code can fix the problem. The flaws are design flaws. These are large problems within the code, like poor authentication or lack of cryptography, that kind of thing, where fixing that would cause a major design change. So for prevention, only 2 different practices. Preventing flaws, lots of practices. But the usage of the bug prevention was only 18% on average and 28% on average for flaws. So people are trying to prevent the flaws more than the bugs. Actually, you can think about that, and it's not a bad thing, because flaws, widespread problems, if you have a bad design, causes lots of rework. So it's better that they focus more on preventing flaws than bugs. But as far as breaking it down, the detail that's in there, one of the actions in the big spreadsheet is this use of a software security group. So that's prevalent in the prevention. And again, the software security group is kind of a central group within an organization that are the security experts. And so as we go through these different practices, I mentioned the practice and then like high usage, just to show you how often it's used. So high usage says a lot of the good companies do it. You should have this software security group too. There was data that showed that the larger the software security group, the higher the score, so the more practices that were adopted. And so the score is on the y-axis. The size typically was about 1.6% of the development organization, just as a rough estimate of the size of the software security group. But having that group is essential for security. And then another practice that, within the details that was high usage was having some kind of centralized security features. And the pictures here is saying, like, no thanks, we're too busy, where they're trying to say, try this wheel. So don't reinvent the wheel is the message. It's best when one software security group creates a solution for things like authentication, role-based access control, key management, and whatnot, and then distributes it to the organization. Since they're the experts, not have every development group do those things by themselves. So high usage of that type of practice. Oops. So another big area in those was dealt with compliance and preventing compliance-related problems. So, this compliance, there's policies, rules, controls, requirements, regulations. There's a lot of things that an organization needs to abide by. They can't only focus on putting their functional requirements out. There's a lot of security requirements and privacy requirements. It's very hard for them to deal with that. So it does say high usage, and many activities are related to compliance. But it's very difficult. And this is the case where I can say that it's great, it's a ripe area for research, is to help an organization be compliant when it comes to security and privacy. So I'll talk for a minute about a couple of the projects that I have worked on with my students. One was a student that worked on a natural language processing system, and what it did was take functional requirements and from that functional requirement, recommend related security and privacy requirements. So it was based upon looking for patterns in the functional requirements and patterns in what I'll call security controls. They came from the NIST 853 document, which were good ways to handle security and privacy requirements. So based upon patterns in the functional requirements and patterns in the controls, it would recommend a requirement. So an example is up at the top, a functional requirement. The system shall provide a means to edit discharge instructions for a particular patient. That's a functional requirement. Generally, a software developer just says, okay, I'll do that. That's functional. But what the system does is based upon patterns in that language, like edit discharge instructions, it knows, okay, that sounds like there's PII there, and it would alert the developer there are requirements related to confidentiality, integrity, and accountability that you need to care about. So these are the associated security and privacy requirements. Then, so it's saying you need to prevent a breach of confidentiality, detect a breach if it does occur, respond to the breach if it does occur, and so on. And then based upon patterns, it will start to tell you this is what it looks like the requirement should be. So it takes templates based upon the patterns and then instantiates the patterns with words from the original requirement. So it goes through this natural language processing system and eventually have requirements like the system shall enforce access privileges that enable authorized users to view discharge instructions. So now it's telling you need to authenticate and whatnot. And so any given requirement would have a number of associated security and privacy requirements. And then now the developer who is used to only thinking about producing functionality is alerted of the related type of security and privacy requirements. So along with that, organizations often not just have to comply with one document, but may need to abide by a number of different documents. So here's some examples: NIST and different NIST and FIPS and privacy, their own privacy policy. They all have to funnel into, some kind of, system, could be mental, could be on paper, that would now let you know you abide by all of the regulations, which is a very difficult thing, especially when people just really care about the functional requirements anyway. And so this is a work in process. Here is 4 or 5 different standards all related to each other. And I know you can't read the documents, but if you did read them, you would, as a human, would say, yes, those all are pretty much the same. But they're all in very different language, very different semantics. And so I have a student right now working with natural language processing, could be deep learning, in order to take a number of different regulations and be able to recommend to the developers, this whole set here, they all look like they're the same thing. You need to do the same thing and you will get all 5 of those, or these conflict with each other, or whatever the information is. Again, to help people with compliance. Another practice that was in that set was a low usage pattern. So there were a number of practices around use of design patterns and attack patterns, and there was very low usage. When I think about attack patterns and security patterns, there are a lot available. So, I wouldn't say from a research standpoint we need to create these patterns. I really think this is a case where we need to become more familiar with the security design patterns that are out there, teach them, learn them, and use them. So that's the message I saw with that. And then another, so this is saying make it harder for attackers. There was a number of practices in that original chart that talked about testing like an attacker and thinking like an attacker. And there are, again, a number of practices that are out there that could be used that are not being used by these organizations. So it's low usage. This particular one is called an abuse case diagram. So from a software engineering standpoint, usually we have actors and the types of things they want the system to be able to do. But an abuse case diagram also puts the bad people on the diagram and what do they want to do so that we can actually stop them from doing it. So thinking ahead at requirements time about what do the hackers want to do, how are they going to try to do it, how do we stop them? And that's all integrated at the start. So that's abuse case diagrams. There's attack trees and threat models. There's a number of techniques that could be used to get this check mark, but the organizations just didn't use it. I don't think that we need to do a lot of research there. We really just need to get people to do them. So we need to teach these practices and use these practices. Related, so that last one was talking about hackers. A related type of practice is to think about accidental misuse cases. So 80%, there was a statistic I saw that said 80% of all the successful attacks are accomplished through getting through a user that will make a mistake, like a phishing type of email, like they social engineering kind of thing, clicking on an email. If you think about like the disruption to the election 2 years ago, it was email. So as software developers, we need to be thinking about how do we develop systems to protect the users from themselves. So in designing a system, thinking about the accidental misusers, the things users will do just because they don't know any better, and put them, again, on this type of a diagram of the types of mistakes they would make and how we would stop them. Okay, so that's the end of the prevention practices. The next set are the detection practices, the things that organizations do to detect problems. Again, I don't expect you to see all these numbers. One thing to note, bugs are at the top, flaws are at the bottom. About even spread of the number of practices that are used for detecting flaws and bugs. Some of the practices are shared between the two. And these are used more prevalently than the prevention practices. Let's see. So one very high use practice are penetration testing. So penetration testing comes up in a number of different places in that chart. One is external penetration testers and one is internal. So penetration testing, if you aren't familiar with that term, is using a system like an attacker would in a very opportunistic way. So penetration testing is often done by a security expert who understands the types of actions that an attacker will take, works very opportunistically at the system, just the way an attacker would. And so a very high use practice, one of the highest use practice, is to hire external penetration testers. A lower use, but still pretty high, is internal, so getting internal developers to be able to do that type of testing. Also, there's other security testing that is done, again, pretty high use. So we need to make sure within our classes that we're teaching students to think like an attacker, attack systems like an attacker would, and do just general security testing. Okay. Another high-use practice is static analysis tools. I mentioned them earlier. So it's use of tools that would look through the code and identify patterns. And it is high use, patterns that indicate security vulnerabilities. It is a high-use practice. If there is any research related to this, it's because static analysis tools that find these often have a high false positive rate. So a lot of indicators of problems that are actually not security problems. And so there's always a quest for these tools to have less false positives so they can be used more efficiently. A low use, so static analysis was high use. Another form of test tools that had low use were fuzzing tools. So fuzzing tools are more dynamic tools, and what they do is they understand what the types of input attackers would try, and they just stuff bad input. So if there's an input field, they'll try to stuff a SQL injection string, a cross-site scripting string, a buffer overflow string, at all of the different input fields in order to see if they can actually get in. So fuzzing tools are very effective. They don't have a lot of false positives, but they're not as comprehensive. So they won't find all of the vulnerabilities, but they'll find some. This is low usage, and the tools are out there. They can be open source. And so if I was to think about why is it low usage, I think it's awareness, that people don't quite understand the capabilities of fuzzing tools. And this is a practice that I would say we want to make sure that we're teaching students so that they know coming out that these types of tools are available. Another low-use practice is just automation as a whole. There's lots of different places within those practices that indicate automation of attackers' actions, automation of security in general is very low usage. And this is definitely an area that needs more research. So this timeline here is a timeline used in a continuous deployment environment where with continuous deployment, the developer makes a change, checks the code in, and a number of checks take place, and it's deployed without any human hands. And so what we want in this automated pipeline are some security tests. But right now, we don't have those types of tests available that are used at a high use rate by teams. So we need to think about why is that? What kind of checks can we get into this pipeline related to security so that they're effective and they're not really disrupting the workflow of the developer too much. So test automation from security is definitely an area ripe for research. Oops. Okay. So a practice that is really non-existent that is definitely ripe for research is any kind of automation for design flaw detection. So we have static analysis tools. As I mentioned before, they find bugs. They find small things. We have no tools that would really detect on a large scale that you have a design flaw that would make the system insecure. And so that is definitely an area ripe for research, is how can we develop a tool that would tell us that. And so another practice that is prevalent within the continuous deployment companies that could be made more widespread is within continuous deployment, if a developer is in the middle of a change, within the middle of making the software behave differently, they put feature flags around that change, and they keep deploying their change so that they don't have a merge conflict, but they block it from being used by a customer, by a feature flag. And these types of feature flags are used very prevalently in continuous deployment. They're used prevalently as the deployment goes out. There's called flighting, where only a certain population gets some of the changes. But what security and privacy professionals do when changes are put behind these types of feature flags is if they understand this change has some security or privacy implications, they will tell the developer, you can't unblock this code until I make a check. And so that's a great way to be deploying changes all the time and enable security and privacy testing before deployment. Another practice that can make it easier for developers is use of vulnerability prediction models. And this is an area of research that my students and I have done for a number of years. This is a needle in the haystack. Finding the vulnerabilities out there are like finding a needle in the haystack. There's not that many of them. And so knowing where to look is helpful for a developer. I've had a couple of PhD students who have worked on vulnerability prediction. The one that is still in progress right now uses what we call the risk-based attack surface approximation. The attack surface of a system are all the paths into and out of a system. And it's very difficult to know the true attack surface of a system, all of the paths into and out of a system. Very comprehensive, very computationally complex. And so what we are doing is approximating the attack surface by looking at all the paths that appear on a stack trace from a crash dump. So stack trace will tell you all of the modules, functions, methods that were hit by this crash dump. And then those are all marked as being on the attack surface because we know some type of external event caused the path, the system to go through that path, and that path also has some kind of an anomaly to it. So we declare those to be on the risk-based attack surface. He's done 3 different studies so far, one on Windows, one on Firefox, and one on Fedora. And what it shows for each of these, say for the first on Windows, that 48% of the code is on the attack surface, the risk-based attack surface, and 95% of the vulnerabilities are there. For Firefox, 14% of the code is on this risk-based attack surface, but 85% of the vulnerabilities. And then finally, Fedora, 8.9% of the packages and 63% of the vulnerabilities are on there. So what this is really saying to the developer is you can narrow down where to look based upon whether it appeared on a crash dump or not. There's other vulnerability prediction models based upon complexity, based upon developer behavior as well. And then finally, response. So what did teams do to respond to vulnerabilities? And again, from the earlier point, these are the highest used practices. And it's because the attack happened. What do they have to respond at this point. And so a number of the practices have very high usage. Some of them have lower usage, but most of them have much high usage because they have no choice but to respond. One of the most important things that I mentioned earlier that we need to make sure that we do is have the ability to get fixes out quickly. And so this was the Jeep that sent the USB sticks, or the Tesla that was able to get the security fixes out over the air. I mean, we're getting more and more used to having fixes like on our phones and Windows updates and Mac updates. So lots of development organizations are having the mechanisms in place to quickly get security fixes out fast, but not all systems do. So we need to make sure, as we're coming up with a cybersecurity plan, that we have the ability to get the fixes out as quickly as possible. Another way that we can respond quickly is to more quickly identify the fact that an attack is underway or a breach is underway. A lot of data would show that there are threats out there that go undetected for, I think on average, 6 months. So how can we detect that some kind of anomalous behavior is going on? And one of the ways is to look at the log files or any kind of instrumentation. And with continuous deployment, increasingly organizations that use that are experimenting on you and I all the time. So Netflix is one, Facebook is one, where as they're deploying these changes in if you've ever heard the term lean startup, in an experimentation kind of way, they're making changes and testing our reaction to their changes and either keeping the changes or throwing them away if it appears we don't like them. So they're instrumenting us, they're instrumenting our actions, and they're studying those files that, and so through those files you can identify what is good behavior, what is bad behavior. And they're not as much using that to identify an attacker at this point, but it should be easy to exploit this type of instrumentation in order to identify that something anomalous is taking place and to identify that it has happened. So that's a research area. So to summarize, what I tried to do here was to inform based upon the data from these companies, or what should we be teaching to students so that they are better prepared to go out and help with cybersecurity. And if you're a student, what should I be learning? What should I be doing on the job and owning my role in cybersecurity? And finally, from a researcher standpoint, what can we research to make it easier for developers to develop securely or harder for the attackers to have a successful attack? So that's the end of the presentation. Any questions? Yeah. Right, yeah. So the question, if you didn't hear it, so what about people who just learn to program online? People who were out there before any kind of security education was taking place. And it's a hard problem, and so it's retraining programs, other online programs. Like I know I had an NSF grant that I just finished up, which was to put out a free online class. So we just need to keep doing things like that. In the practices in the BSIM, there's a whole section on training. And so having a training effort at a company is really important, because as you're indicating, a lot of people they don't even know that they should be thinking about security. Such a focus on just getting functionality out. Yeah. Yeah, so that was really the limitation that I put way back in the beginning. I mean, all they did was, what do they do? And not as much at, if you do these, then this is the best result. They don't have any dependent variables, so it's really hard to do that. I had a PhD student who tried to do that, and he developed a model, and part of the model is to say, I mean, it's a very hard thing to do because it's not just like all vulnerabilities are not created equal. One vulnerability may be a target for an attacker because it has some special PII that it's protecting. And so a high-use system that protects really critical assets will be attacked more. Another system may have the same number of vulnerabilities, but nobody cares about that application. So it's very hard to just say vulnerability density is the dependent variable, because the application that's never used might look like it's perfectly secure, but actually no one ever used it. So it is a complicated problem to truly guide an organization at what should they do most efficiently and effectively. Yeah. Yeah.
Just curious, and this seems highly related to a lot of maturity models I've seen. Are you working a lot to sort of refine some of the maturity models? Some of them are used to guide organizations.
Yeah, so BSIM stands for Building Security and Maturity Model. I should have said that. So it is a maturity model, and so what I didn't show in there, each one of those practices has a number, and if it's like 1.1, it's level 1, and 2.1 is level 2, and 3.1 is level 3. And so this is, synopsis, and Gary McGraw saying this is a more advanced practice than that one. So it is guiding organizations. When I looked at the analysis, I wanted to separate it away from the maturity model because I wanted to see, it felt like some of the practices were artificially put in. In some cases, there was a practice that was in level 3 that more people used than one in level 1. So I didn't want to keep it. But it is, the theory of it is a maturity model.
And are they all converging to, it seems like there's a lot of work in the space trying to figure out what's effective and what's good structure. Do you feel like the field is converging? Because that's one place I felt never very satisfied that they were all heading in the same direction.
Yeah, so I only know of 2 maturity models that really are going forward at this point. And BSIM is one, and OpenSAM, which is an OWASP maturity model, is the other one that are used more prevalently. And the 2 of those are quite similar. The OpenSAM is done, it's a self-assessment mostly. I mean, there are some people who do assessments, but for the most part, it's like grade yourself. And it's less effective because of that. I think if you have someone externally coming in and saying, show me your artifacts, that's better. But I mean, there is a lot of similarity between those 2. One of the things, I have tons of data from this. And so what I've been starting to try to do, and it'll be quite a big effort, is mapping this to like the NIST 853 practices or the cybersecurity framework to see how do these all play in. And each has a different type of scope. So BSIM is really building, like it's software engineering related, and the cybersecurity framework is risk related, so it's less technical, more business. And the NIST 853 is more close to the BSIM. So, but I think that it's good to have would be good to have a mapping. Yeah. Yeah, so like, the developers putting in the, opening some doors. I mean, any of these practices in theory could find that. And I know that, there's research being done right in your own school about that. Who was it? Someone was talking about that. Do you know which faculty member? Yeah, there is a faculty member here who is working on that. The back doors, detecting, isn't it you? Yeah. Okay, there you go. So yeah, so they're working on those, like, detecting a back door, which is a tough problem. Yeah.
So do you think as programming languages, as their platforms advance, these security features will become more built in technology, or is it always going to be on software developers to actually understand the underlying security?
No, it will be much better if languages are more secure and frameworks, like, the security features are ones that we just adopt. I mean, they have their own, that has their own problem. I mean, we have lots of open source modules. That's another whole problem, is organizations that bring in modules and then there's a vulnerability detected and then they continue to use it without updating it. I mean, 2 big high profile cases of that. Equifax, that I'm sure you heard about, was that case where there's an old module out there. So, but bottom line is it's better to consolidate effort and have the experts work on modules and work on programming languages that would take it away from the developer to have to care as much. So all of that is really ripe for research, and I know some research is going on in Penn State about that as well. Yeah.
So very often people develop code under pressure to meet deadlines, they keep the budget at their cost, and this creates incentive for them to cut corners.
I mean, that's the reality is, I mean, you know, still, even with all the publicity of every day a new attack, is organizations still care about getting functionality out, even when they're in critical domains. You know, the only, I think it would help, like say in continuous deployment, the automated pipeline where there are checks in place. If there were security steps in there that would cause a failure, that would stop the deployment, that would help. But that would need to be a really highly reliable type of check. But that, where it was part of an automated deployment pipeline, I think is probably the only thing that would help in that kind of a case. All the others, they're extra, you know, and the developers hate doing extra things.
So, okay, Don will have the last question, and then
The software product that adds on features from outside developers, that's the incentives and so on. Who's responsible for checking that the add-on is as secure as the rest of the product?
Okay, say the beginning part again, about the add-on.
Well, with Firefox, for instance,
Right.
you can build in contribute extensions, which are not written by the same people as
Yeah.
Firefox. Who's responsible for checking that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the same thing as the Apple Store or any of the, you know, mobile apps. I mean, none of those get checked as well by the provider, so by Firefox or Apple or Google. So who's responsible? You know, it's still the developers, and only a sanity check is done by the repository. You know, if it is deemed insecure, it'll get pulled away. You know, but some damage may have been done in the meanwhile. So there's no good answer for that one at this point.
Okay, guys. So we can continue the conversation with, you know, food and some beverages as well upstairs. So why don't we go ahead and do that? And let's thank Laurie once again for her great talk.
All
Thanks,
right,
Laurie.
thank you. Thank you for your questions.